what capitalism is about a small number of people maintaining power and dominion over limited resources in order to then be able to capitalize on those and lend them out and grow them back into that center. So it's a naturally centralizing kind of mechanism, whereas nature is more mycelial and people are more productive in dispersed networks.
Welcome back to the start of Season 6 of The Impossible Network. Today's guest is Denzil Monk, a filmmaker, a social entrepreneur and an accidental academic. Denzil's dedicated his life to reshaping the narrative from his home region of Cornwall in England, advocating for a more inclusive and regenerative approach to media, culture and the economy. From advocating for Cornish public service media to his impactful film productions, to pioneering ideas like Man Engine, the largest performing mechanical puppet ever created in Britain. Got to check out the YouTube video. Denzil's work is rooted in a deep sense of place, purpose and the power of storytelling. In this episode, we explore his journey, his thoughts on the need to rethink capitalism, and the impact local communities can have on the global stage. Now, over to Denzil. Denzil, welcome to the Impossible Network.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Where do I find you today?
I am in a place called Treath Park, just outside Penzance and Newlyn, right down in the far southwest of Cornwall, which is right on the far southwest of Britain.
Delightful.
It is lovely. We're surrounded by trees here as well. Very beautiful.
Well, let's jump in and let's start with the first big question. Who are you, Denzil, as a human being?
Who am I as a human being? I think, God, that's not an easy question to answer, is it? I'm a Cornishman. I'm a film producer, a husband and a father. That's such a difficult question to answer. Okay, so I'll dig a little deeper. I'm a very curious person. I was curious when you got in touch about the Impossible Network and what you were doing, and it sounded really interesting and fascinating. I'm intrigued by stories, by narratives, by the dots that connect things. I think a metaphor that has been with me a long time is the kind of view of we have a lot of buzzards around us here, and I've always loved buzzards. They used to be quite rare when I was a kid, and now there's lots of them around. The population has really grown, and other raptors as well. And I've always really liked I can't remember where I first read a description of how they see when they're hunting. They kind of look from this great height, and they can see everything, a really wide vista, but then also have like a very forensic, sharp, pinpointed perspective within that. So this kind of dual view of looking at the particular and the general together. So that kind of way of looking at the world is something which has always sort of filled me with a sense of that's how I kind of perceive the world. These kind of two things going on at once. I'm very hyper focused on what I'm doing, but never at the expense of that sort of broader perspective. I'm always thinking about how things connect and where they sit. Maybe overthinking. Others would say overthinking sometimes about how they connect with the other things that are in my mind, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. But whether that's to do with sort of cultural perspective of minoritized nation and language of Cornishness, or whether it's to do with trying to find ways of living and working in the world that are progressive and regenerative rather than destructive and insane, like so much what happens around us.
There's a lot in there. Wow. Yeah, I think a lot of people I've interviewed have talked about their curiosity that drives them, and dot connectors, quite interesting. I've never heard using that a metaphor for buzzards, or for, what did you call them?
Raptors,
yeah, raptors that see this wide vista but also have a very precise focus. When did that thought first emerge?
Probably when I was like maybe 15, 16, around that sort of age. Kind of, I guess when I first started venturing out into the wider world on my own a bit more. And I spent a lot of time wandering and wandering.
I like that. Yeah. Wandering and wandering. Wow.
Around the land, around the cliffs and the moorland. Like, and when I say I spent a lot of time, I spent like most of my hours between probably the age of sort of 15, 16 and my early 20s were spent wandering aimlessly.
And wondering. That should be a course at university.
Yeah, well, I did. I tried a course at university, and then I left halfway through to go wandering. Even
Fascinating. That's a lovely answer to who you are as a human being. It creates a nice perspective and a broad vista for the conversation. So, what or who impacted the person that you are? This person that became aware of being a wanderer and a wanderer at age 15.
so, I guess the people in my childhood were the most influence on me were my family. I mean, my dad was a proud Cornishman, and he was a teacher and a preacher, and we were involved in theatre, amateur dramatics kind of thing when I was a kid, which his father was before him as well. We kind of, like, my whole childhood really was that we were always very active doing things in the community, whether that was to do with church or school or just the local community of the sort of the place where, not where we actually lived, but where the school was when my dad taught. And the church that we went to as children, it was a small village called Gwynia, and we spent a lot of time there in a small farming community. And it's kind of the sense of the world being something that is the world and the people in it, and not just the people in it, but the land itself being something that you have a responsibility for and to, rather than something for you to exploit, I think is something that was imbued in my consciousness from a very young age, initially through a very sort of Christian perspective, which that sort of fell away around when I through my wanderings as a teenager. But the ethics, I suppose, the kind of the idea of there being an ethical foundation to your purpose as a human being, having an existence, that that there is some purpose to it, and B, that purpose should be about more than just personal gain. You know, I was brought up under Thatcher and all that kind of horrific kind of, you know, my mindset was kind of in the 80s as a, you know, really those sort of formative years, with all of the gloriousness of that decade and all of the horrendousness of that decade. And, you know, things that really stood out in that time were things like the Falklands War, and just the selfishness that was just kind of like being perpetuated, and those narratives around that, the kind of quite insidious, you know, in the stories that come through our TV screens and in all of the advertising, and the whole kind of mindset that's just kind of, you know, progressively got worse in a lot of ways, whilst also cracking at the seams in this in the following decades. But
It's probably worth just mentioning that because a lot of listeners to the podcast are in the US. The UK, I suppose, just like the US, it was a time of great transformation where Reagan was in power in the US. And it was the time of the beginning of globalization, the deregulation of the financial markets, and it was impacting London. Thatcher was in power, as you said, war with Argentina and the Falklands, the last vestiges of colonialism, imperialism, the miners' strike that was happening at the time.
In Cornwall, it's mining community, and it's kind of, it's not just about it being like one of the main industries that people's livelihoods that's to do with it. It's kind of because that mining, a destructive environmental practice though it is, like the kind of the, I guess, the sense of community and pride and heritage of that mining history in Cornwall is really intrinsically interwoven with our sort of national identity, I guess, because people have been mining the land here in one form or another since the Mesolithic, you know, from greenstone axes just 10 miles down the road from where I am now. And you can see that whole 10,000 years of history in the landscape. You know, you stand on a hill and you literally see, you know, the first stones that were erected by human beings in this land, next to a medieval field system, next to a modern glass fronted monstrosity built around an old granite cottage versus home. You know, so there's like all of those layers of piled up on top of each other. But it was interesting what you say about globalization and that sense. I mean, guess as a child, your sense of the world emerges from your parents, very sort of from your mother to your family, and eventually sort of at whatever age sort of become your world gets marginally bigger as the years pass. And I remember, I think I was 8 when the Falklands War was happening, and I remember that sort of, I feel like I became politically aware at that time. That kind of is the time in my memory where I kind of became aware that there was this whole world of adult stuff going on that was pretty horrendous, and that alongside news images of police brutality attacking people who were just trying to survive, trying to make a living, all of this stuff going on. So it kind of, but then alongside that, something that was really beautiful about that kind of growing sense of connection in the world. I can't remember what the project was called, but there was a project that happened around that time, which was the first time it was a global music project where musicians all around the world, like on every continent, all played. I think it might have been, I don't know if it was on TV or if
it was Live Aid.
It wasn't Live Aid. There was something else. It was people in different places all around the world playing music together at the same time, like one kind of orchestra.
Pre Live Aid.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called, but I remember the record, I guess, or it might have been a tape, I can't remember, that came off the back of it, and there was definitely a TV program about it. If the name comes back to me, I'll say. But it was like around that time, that was such a mind-blowing thing, the idea that, it sounds strange now because we're so connected, and here we are kind of, talking on a podcast thousands of miles away from each other, and it just seems normal to be staring at your face thousands of but at that time it was really quite mind-blowing, this, and really exciting, this sense that we had this connection with everybody everywhere. And these two things sit in opposition to each other. There's these wars going on and destruction and selfishness alongside the potentiality of people being literally in harmony with each other. So I guess, that was a good time to be growing up, maybe. It was interesting.
Yeah. So that impact of the responsibility for land, the ethical foundation that came from the Christian influence, the growing awareness of the duality of conflict and connection, the power of connection, and the destructive nature of conflict, of being just the very much reality. How did that frame your worldview and set you on the path that you went on during that time of wandering and wondering?
Yeah, I think I knew from a very early age. I guess I never wanted to. I didn't want to participate in mainstream society. That was not like I literally had no. Not it wasn't even that I had no desire to. I kind of had a complete aversion to it. I did the things that I saw happening, and the way that school and then college and then job advisors and what have you presented the kind of the options in life didn't resonate with me. And part of that is geographical and economic, about kind of the way things were here. Again, when I was sort of in my formative years, late teenage and sort of early 20s even, it's like that whole kind of mindset growing up in Hale, the town I grew up in, and same is true for a lot of Cornwall and for a lot of other post-industrial places. It was, your options are, you can work in the field, you can work in the kitchen, or you can move up the line if you want to do anything else and move away. And that kind of sits on top of a kind of a deeper root of the Cornish diaspora, the kind of huge swathes of the population moved to America or to Africa or to Australia, with the kind of the mining diasporas in the 18th and 19th century. It's like that kind of sits there as a historical thing. But then on top of it, so like when I was growing up in Hale, it was, are you going to move away and, go to a city and do something interesting, or are you going to go to Australia? It was kind of like the two options that were sort of sat.
Go north or go south.
There was no sense of like there being any purpose or any rationale for staying and being and doing something meaningful here, which is kind of what I wanted to do. So I went away. I went away, studied away a bit, dropped out, travelled, kind of did some other things away, but always felt very rooted. I think it's because of or largely because of the time that I did spend wandering around with the ancient stones and ancient places. And it's it's a very beautiful and compelling place. Lots of people are drawn here for that. But I don't know, there's a gravity, a kind of magnetic gravity that's always pulled me back and made me want to struggle to do the things I want to do here in this place for this place, rather than maybe from some perspectives make life easy and go and do it elsewhere.
When you said you either stay in Cornwall and work in wherever the mines or go up the line, when you talk about up the line, you mean train lines?
Yeah, I mean up the line, because it's such a sort of narrowing peninsula. I mean, where I am, it's kind of 7 miles from the north coast to the south, so it's almost like an island, sort of, and 10 miles to Land's End. So it's kind of up the line is, I mean, anywhere east of Camborne, but it's sort of there's, which again is a funny thing, and it is that's a kind of phrase that is very familiar to anyone in Penwith, certainly, and it's kind of it does go back to the train line, because before that, and the connections that this place has had with the world over the last several thousand years has been in every direction from the water rather than on the land. But because we now live in a world that's connected by train lines, and more so by motorways and roads, and all of our kind of perspectives are forced inwards in that way, rather than out along the waterways, which used to be our main channels, then I guess that's why.
On LinkedIn, you describe yourself as a social entrepreneur, accidental academic. So getting to that point of being a social entrepreneur, accidental academic, there was a decision that stopped you from continuing to wander outside of Cornwall, to go up the line and come back and focus your curiosity and creative energies on the locale of Cornwall and the community that you grew up in. What triggered that?
I'll be good to come back to the accidental academic bit afterwards, maybe. But the social entrepreneur, it was when I first heard that phrase, I was like, I recognised it. I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of, because I always had a bit of, because of my loathing of capitalism in its essential form, and in its essential form, it is a self-destructive kind of process. It's like capitalism. I'm sure there are people who will argue for capitalism, but really what capitalism is about a small number of people maintaining power and dominion over limited resources in order to then be able to capitalize on those and lend them out and grow them back into that center. So it's a naturally centralizing kind of mechanism, whereas nature is more mycelial in and people are more productive in dispersed networks, and come to talk about that in sort of technology and the future as well. But like the kind of the systems that we find ourselves stuck in and living in and working in are not things that we've kind of gone, oh, this is a good idea, let's do this. We kind of, there's these mechanisms that we emerge into, and systems that we grow into and then perpetuate. And yeah, I think the kind of the localism, the idea of being present in a place, giving of yourself, of your energy to that place, is something that is, I mean, it doesn't matter where you are or where you feel connected to. I just kind of think, like, rather than trying to constantly elsewhere and wishing you weren't where you are, it surely makes more sense to really immerse yourself in where you are. And for me, that happens to be the place that I grew up. I know for a lot of other people, it isn't. And, there's no right or wrong with that. It's wherever you find yourself. But this, like, part of the driver for me with the social entrepreneurship ideas, that this place, although it is very rich in beauty and rich in history and rich in culture, it's very poor economically, or the economics of the place are very, very split. There's a very small number of wealthy people sat in amongst a large number of very impoverished people, which is to do with the economics of the last 200 years as much as anything else. But it's something which, having sort of grown up in,
and accentuated by the economics of the last 20 years, arguably.
absolutely, yeah. Well, and the economics that Reagan and Thatcher very consciously set in motion, and that haven't been questioned, not at a government level, haven't been questioned since. Despite all of the evidence proving without a shadow of doubt that to the idea of trickle down benefits and all of these kind of things that get talked about, there's like a real kind of misstep between the actual reality and this sort of perceived reality, and it's, I guess, if you keep yourself locked away from actually seeing the world, then it's very easy to perpetuate those illusions. But growing up in a place where the Industrial Revolution started kind of, back in the 18th century and in the early 19th, where the kind of the technological evolutions that had a massive impact across the world in tin production, and then declined because the economics of the world shifted. So, and then, there's a town not far from us called Redruth, which at one point was the richest town in Europe, and it's, got some good things going on now. But when I was growing up in Hale, another industrial towns like Hale, Campbell, Redruth, these places, they were shitholes. They were the places that nobody wanted to be. Nobody wanted to go. They're not the beautiful tourist spots. They're not the picturesque fishing coves. They're just places that used to have a meaning and a purpose, and at that time didn't appear to have. It's like it kind of got lost. So I think but still, that's my home. That's kind of where I come from. That's where I live and want to be in these spaces. So it's a real kind of dilemma. Then you go, well, what do you do with that? So really the impetus then is like, well, the mining industry has gone, or certainly in the way that it was, and for whatever reason, my kind of inclination has always been in the creative and cultural sector, in storytelling, kind of filmmaking particularly, and sort of, as the years go by and you do things, then you build up skills and networks and all the rest of it. So I sort of found myself in a place where it's like, well, actually, and also looking at the other Celtic nations and looking at what was working there, and the idea that it's often said one of the reasons why the Welsh language survived and thrived is because of S4C, because they had their own broadcaster. So if a people has their own voice, then they can reflect not just their own world, but their view on the rest of the world. And this is missing in Cornwall. Like, where's our voice? Where's our industry? Where's our media industry? We don't have one. So that kind of then that realization, which is a gradual thing, probably over the course of maybe 10, 15 years, that kind of went from a sort of a little light bulb realization into leaning back into the accidental academic bit, into a research project that I was the principal investigator of, looking at what a Cornish public service media would look like, into then working now both with my own company, with Bosena, and for Screen Cornwall as a commissioning exec, creating Cornish cultural and Cornish language films and programs, and trying to advocate both within Cornwall and with the British government, with DCMS, and make the case for why and what and how a Cornish public service media should look like. So if that existed when I was 20, I'd have just gone and worked in that industry, but it didn't exist. So it's kind of, so you go, there's a hole there. Like, mining isn't the industry that I'm going to go into because it doesn't exist, although there is a sort of a mining industry restarting now, but like that kind of cultural space didn't exist. And there was this hole around representation of voice, and just the only representations you ever saw or heard of Cornish people and characters on screen were kind of derogatory outside of eye looking in kind of, these simple yokel peasant marrying, all this kind of stereotypes that exist. And the world is changing, and that perspective is changing for the better, but slowly. We've still got ways to go.
It's really interesting. When you talk about Hale and Redruth, it made me think of Scotland and the mining towns there. Again, not the pretty picturesque villages of fishing villages on the coast, but the extractive nature of pulling stuff out of the ground and then leaving them bereft of any economic gain from the extraction. And the similarities with Scotland, I suppose, and Cornwall is both there is a native tongue, a language, not just a version of English, but a natural tongue. So for people in America that maybe don't understand that, there's Gaelic in Scotland. There's also Scots, which is different to English in the same way the Welsh have their language, the Irish have their Celtic language. Could you maybe just explain what the Cornish voice is and the historical backdrop to the Cornish language?
Yeah, so Canuic you Agant Havas. Cornish is our language. It's the language that evolved in this land. It's an autochthonous language. It's a language that grew in the communities of the people who first settled in this place. And actually the Welsh language and the Cornish language and the Breton language,
which is France,
right? Or it's Brittany, but it's contained within a French paradigm. In the same,
exactly,
yeah. They're all very closely related, and Cornish and Welsh until the 6th century were the same language and were spoken across a great swathe of what is now England. England didn't exist until 1,000 years ago, despite what it might think it did. It's kind of we're taught in schools a very simplified revisionist version of history that kind of goes Flintstones version of cavemen bashing each other on the head through into kind of Greek mythology and Roman mythology into Roman Empire into England. Isn't England great? And I guess for the American audience, and make America great again. It's like this kind of mythology has a kind of there's this simplistic root of that has got nothing to do with actual history. One of the things you mentioned when you got in touch before was about book recommendations. So I'm just going to drop one in here because it's pertinent. The Dawn of Everything, which is a book by David Graeber and David Wengrow. I think they wrote the first 5,000 years, which I haven't read, but The Dawn of Everything is an incredible, it's actually really subversive and interesting, because what it does is it very forensically looks at examples of different communities and cultures throughout time and around the world, picking various examples, and unpicks this idea that somehow there's a natural evolution towards us being city living capitalists, and that's the pinnacle of human evolution. And it kind of goes, actually, there's a lot of different ways that different communities have lived right next to each other at many different points of their history, some of which have evolved from one into the other, and others have evolved from that into another. And there's no straight lines in this process. We have this idea of civilization being this thing with this sort of linear progression, and a lot of people seem to think that we are at the pinnacle of that evolution, or certainly very close to it. And it's like, actually, no, the kind of the agrarian, the farmers kind of planting the first crops, and then that evolving into having grain stores, and that evolving into buildings, and this, it's like, there are threads of histories like that, but it's not the fundamental point that book makes, which I found really, as I say, subversive, is that rather than us assuming that we are where we are because we have to be, because this is where we've evolved to be, it's like, if we just step back from that and go, what kind of world do we want to live in? How do we want to organize our societies and our politics and our resources and our means? We don't have to do it this way. We don't have to subscribe to the paradigm that we've been brought up with, economic thinking, like Kate Raworth's book Donut Economics, another great mind-blowing book, again lays out the history of economic thinking in that kind of way and goes, here's a different way of thinking about it. And I just think, these are really subversive in a good way. Some people might think subversive is a bad thing, but I think considering where we're starting from, what the norms are, subversive is generally quite a good thing. Yes, they're just really subversive ideas, kind of going, it doesn't have to be business as usual. There are other ways of doing things, other ways of thinking about things, other perspectives. And some of those perspectives it's not even about going, this is one paradigm, let's change it to another paradigm that's better, because in a sense that has got a sort of linearity built into it as well. It's like, what if we throw out the whole idea of having to be set within a paradigm, and just it's not an easy thing to do, and we are constrained by our language and our other preset thought processes.
I mean, I suppose if you're applying your wide vista and hyper-focused analogy, looking at the wide vista of the world at the moment, that we're seeing the fracturing of arguably the capitalist system, it manifesting itself through political polarization, identity politics, people searching for answers, seeking community, seeking connection, increasingly connected in a disconnected in a connected world, dealing with mental health issues. It all ladders up to what I can remember the name of the guy has written about it. It teaches at Columbia, the polycrisis that we're facing. And we're looking to extremes on the political left and right for answers, one accusing the other of being communist, the other of being fascist. And the reality is, there's a need for a reimagining of the way communities come together, whether they be in small, hyper-localized communities or in large, hyper-connected cities. There needs to be a wholesale reimagining of how we organize, because clearly, whether it be in the Appalachian area of America or even here in California, you can see the disparity between the uber wealthy and the desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And people have been left behind. And I saw it in Texas when I was living there. You could see it in New York State. It's happening in Scotland. It's happening, presumably, in Cornwall.
It's that polarization. It's exactly that.
So, I mean, I read and listened a lot about Kate Raworth's Donut Economics a few years ago. I thought it does feel like someone is actually taking a step back and going, how can we reimagine economics in a different way that is more holistic, and there's still a regenerative nature to it, but it isn't completely extractive and destructive. How do you come at it, and how do you see that potentially having an impact? And maybe we just look at it in relation to, in a hyper local way, in a community and an area like Cornwall, where you could see people start to implement something at a local level to reimagine the way we organize.
Well, it's interesting, and you kind of look at the way that seminal kind of thinking like that can play out. So, and the thing that I really like about donut economics is the visual model of it. This donut where you've got a social foundation and planetary boundary. It's so simple. It makes so much sense. I guess I'm a very visual person, so although for many years I've been involved in social enterprises and thinking about things in that sort of triple bottom line kind of way, people, planet, and profit. It wasn't until that somebody told me about donut economics before I read the book, and it was just like, oh yeah, that just makes that just that model, that kind of visual model makes so much sense. And it kind of is such a simple thing. It's like, rather than having a triangle, a pyramid, you have a circle. It's as simple as you could boil all of this conversation down and go, we just need to stop being a triangle and start being a circle. That's a very simplistic geometric approximation of where we are as humanity on the planet at the moment. But within that, there's this sense of circularity and all of the sort of circular economy things. And what's great is, like, because there have been a few individuals who've kind of like caught onto that way of thinking and then perpetuated it and shared that knowledge in a very free and open and engaging way. What's happened in Cornwall with that, which is, I think, really exciting, is that Cornwall Council, which is actually, despite all the failings of all bureaucracies everywhere, is quite progressive in its thinking and has grown massively in confidence as a sort of advocate of its land and people and culture and language over the last decade or so. I think, I can't remember if it was maybe 2-3 years ago, actually changed their policies to incorporate donut economic thinking at a fundamental level. So I don't think they talk about it as in slightly different language, but it's coming from that thinking. So ostensibly, every decision that gets made by Cornwall Council, so this is to do with social housing, adult social care, roads, education, everything that they have power and influence over should, and I say should because having the policy and then enacting it are slightly different things, should go through a donut economic thought process and decision-making process. So a proper consideration of you would hope that councils, governments should be fundamentally doing this anyway, but categorically they're not, or few and far between are. But so within Cornwall, there's a high level, I would say a higher than average level of awareness of donut economic thinking, so which provides a good foundation. Then
do you think that's embraced at both ends of the political spectrum?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it's a politicized thing at all. Actually, I think it's it's maybe partly because Cornwall has a long history of being economically sidelined, left behind, mismanaged. I've lived through 3 or 4 7-year rounds of, like, consciously lived through several rounds of, this is pre-Brexit, European structural funding cycles where, hundreds of millions of pounds of money was made available to develop the infrastructure and to grow the economic GDP of Cornwall so that it would hit the European average, as was. And strangely, through all of those decades, it kind of remained pretty much where it was, which was significantly below the European average, hence the structural funds that came in. And my perspective on that is that 90% of the reason why that's the case is because most of that money was managed through a government office southwest in Exeter, or through Quangos in Bristol, in urban centres in other parts of the southwest region of England, who had not only no understanding of the reality of what it's like living in Cornwall, but no care about the cultural context or the community context, or really the economic context. That they would be managed by people who are used to managing large amounts of money, so people who've run big businesses and with hundreds of millions of dollars of turnover, and kind of understand that. But that doesn't mean they understand a community where I can't remember the percentages, but where SMEs are mostly micro businesses and the vast majority of employees are actually freelancers rather than employees. It's a very different, whilst we have a really strong creative industry sector in Cornwall, it doesn't look like it looks in a city structure, or somewhere where there's a large kind of manufacturing or production base or something. So that lack of understanding, that lack of indigenous understanding of what is happening in a place and how things work in a place, which is partly cultural, but it's largely just a very practical thing of seeing what's going on around you rather than thinking you know better because you think you know better. So that's kind of that's the failing of the last of the entirety of the last half century that I've been alive on this planet, of how things have been done to Cornwall. So it just kind of strengthens my belief and my activism that we need to be more self-determining and self-empowered. And that's not at the exclusion of anybody, and quite the contrary. It is about being a strong, independent voice within a well-connected, interconnected global network. That's the future.
That leads perfectly to the third big question. What are you working to achieve before you shuffle off this mortal coil?
So, well, I guess I think that if I was going to boil that down into one big tangible thing, I think I would say the creation of a sustainable Cornish public service media is something that I've been working towards for a long time and would love to see happen properly. I mean, there's action happening around it. There's things. The biggest thing being there was a media bill that went through Parliament just before the election, days before the election, within which Cornish is recognised as a minority language, national minority language in the legislation. So it was recognised by the government back in 2014, but that didn't really translate into any tangible support. The fact that there's now a piece of legislation in this media bill that recognises Cornish equivalents with Welsh and Gaelic, it means that there's an imperative now for, whether it's through the BBC or through some other mechanism, for the DCMS, the department that's responsible for cultural output, to create some provision for that. And that's part of a bigger and more complex picture of legislative kind of things that sit around it. But the exciting thing with that is that something that 10 years ago, when I was sort of first looking into this in a more forensic way, was like, that's what's missing, and feeling like, God, trying to get something into legislation is a long, hard, slow process and needs the support of your MPs, which up until the last election, for the last far too long, were all Tory MPs that weren't particularly well aligned in a lot of ways. But I think that is the thing that I would feel like I can rest now, that something is there. But that said, if that happened tomorrow, I'd be like, well, that's one small step along the way, because actually that's a small step along the journey of all indigenous languages and cultures and all minoritized nations and all minoritized groups and people, and discriminated against voices and underrepresented voices having a place of equality and justice and equal opportunity in the world, and which fundamentally there's only really one end point for that thought process, which is that you have to dismantle global capitalism, because without and dismantle is a very deliberate choice of word, because it's not going to happen by wishing it would happen or by raging against it. It's got to be something that's more engineered. And I think the engineering to dismantle that global capitalist paradigm is something, though not economic thinking helps with, it's something which the B Corp movement is an intrinsic part of. It's something which in the UK, the Better Business Act, hopefully will come to fruition. It's something which the whole kind of world of social enterprise kind of sits in a space that it's like the third sector is never going to do it whilst the private sector exists. The only thing that's going to fundamentally shift the dial on that is if the private sector stops being selfish and existing for the benefit of shareholders and perpetuating capitalism, and shifts its focus to its stakeholders, which is the prerequisite of constitutionally becoming a B Corp, and shifts that focus away from just making money for a small number of people and thinks really long and hard about the value that any entity is creating and the impact that it's having, and takes an honest and transparent look at those things, and just basically just does better. That's what we need to do. We need to collectively do better in that space quickly before fuck it all up.
Yeah, well, there is an urgency on many levels. I like the way you use the term dismantle, because I think a lot of people just view things as a duality: socialism, capitalism, communism, capitalism, whatever. It's a spectrum, the two ends of it. In reality, I don't think you're talking about that. You're not saying the alternative is socialism and capitalism, but it's a reimagining of an alternative system where terms stakeholder, instead of shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, what the B movement talks about, if we think about the donut economics and we don't use capitalism and communism or socialism as it is, what is the model that you're imagining where communities all around the world who are maybe minorities have their voice, where people are not marginalized, where there is not extraction, where there is shared resources, and at the same time it isn't following a Marxist, Leninist, communist model, which has been in its implementation, certainly through nation states, in whether it be in China or in Russia, wherever it's been trying to be implemented, has failed. What would you describe as the model? Does it need a name? I mean, people like, for example, John Alexander has argued it's not a question of capitalism, communism. It's a story we follow, that we've been living either the subject story or the consumer story, and actually the citizen story is what we are all naturally gravitate towards. When you take away isms out of it and you apply John Alexander's sort of model, you sort of go, okay, yeah, I get that. We are all citizens and we should have participatory democracy. We should all have a voice. We should connect in hyper-local ways with our community and look after each other. We should be self-sustaining, regenerative communities. And you look at ways of doing that. Donut economics seems to be a model for doing that. But we're still living within the paradigm of a political system that is naturally polarized between left and right.
Yeah, so there's a reason why I have never felt any urge to go into politics, and that's because I don't think the political spectrum is where the solutions are going to come from, because they can't, because they exist entirely in that duality, and I think we have to synthesize the duality. We have to find a way of being that isn't bouncing between the is it this or is it that, is it left, is it right, is it black, is it white. It's like it's actually it's a very simple thing. It really is a simple thing. It is just about, without sounding like an old hippie, having peace in your heart and giving a shit about what goes on around you and the impact that you have in the world. And the thing is, I think most people actually do, most people, even some of the people who are perpetuating some of the worst, horrendous fucking crimes on the planet, actually, as individual people, for the most part, I think have love in their hearts and are trying to make the world a better place. They might be trying to make it a better place just for their family because they're frightened that if they let go of that and allow anybody else to have a slice of their pie, then it'll all go to shit. But, that's because they're living in a fear-based mediascape that perpetuates this mythology of dualism. So actually the solutions aren't political. They can't be political. They have to be narrative. They have to be about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the stories that we tell each other, and the stories that we share with each other, which is probably why I ended up working in a industry that is about telling and sharing stories. That's kind of my motivation for that, because it's again, there's not a moment in time where I kind of went, oh, this is what I'm going to do, because it was definitely more of a careering than a career. But for me, the kind of the place where I can engineer change is in the media world, is in that space, because it makes sense to my mind to work in that way and to try. And actually that did come from an early experience. When I was 18, I went to Rose Bruford's College of Speech and Drama to do a degree in writing for theatre, which I managed half of before I dropped out of college and went off travelling. But in the 6 months into that, I wrote a play called The Green Man, which I then put on in St Ives, not far away from here, as part of a St Ives September Festival. And it was a labour of love, and lots of people that was at college with came together and we worked on it, put it together, put it on. And after the first night of it, the first night of that play, one of the audience members came up afterwards and spoke to me about how much it had meant to them and how much it had touched, reached them in terms of what I was trying to say. It was very sort of clear, sort of environmental message in the play. about cutting down forests and building second homes, basically. But and at that point, I remember really clearly feeling like the whole thing was worth it because one mind had got it. It's like the communication had happened. Didn't matter whether that was one person or 100 people or 1 million people. And there's other, like, obviously scale has its import in other circumstances, but that idea that an idea is shared and is communicated, that there's a simplicity that is what storytelling is all about, I guess. Is kind of, if you share a thought, an idea, and somebody else gets it, there's that understanding is a point of human contact and connection. I mean, I'm preaching to the converted. You set up the Impossible Network. This is what it's all about. These connections and these meetings of minds and ideas, and it's such an energizing thing. It kind of, you can put months or years of work into something, and if it touches one person's soul, then it's worth it.
So we've covered a lot about what you're working to achieve in terms of creating a sustainable public service media environment in Cornwall, and how that then might have a ripple effect in other communities around the world. You've talked about the social entrepreneurship, the accidental academic. Explain.
For the most part, through the last sort of 20 years or so, I've done a bit of teaching alongside whatever else I've been doing, and at times that's been more significant and at other times less significant. And it's quite ironic that we're having this conversation about it now, because I had been working as a senior lecturer at Falmouth University up until Monday.
Right, okay.
I was on a sabbatical this year, but I've left now, so because I need to focus on Bosena, on the film and TV business that growing. So, and I'll continue to have a relationship with the place and work with them in other ways. But yeah, I think I kind of, from teaching at university, I then came to understand what academia was a bit more, and the kind of the drive for research within that. And that's something that really interested me. And actually, from the ideas like the case for Cornish public service media, that piece of research is something which I kind of instigated and then delivered through my role at Falmouth, kind of for Cornwall Council. But and then found myself in this academic world where there were refs and and all these kind of different ideas bouncing around, and got involved in some other research projects, and which I find endlessly fascinating, and could very happily, if there was nothing else that I felt was more important for me to do right now, spend my life just in that world. But it's kind of, I think it doesn't suit my sensibility. There's too many rules, too many ways of doing things the way they have to be done, rather than making it up as you go along, which feels more comfortable for me. And so I've ended up, over the years, I've written some chapters in some books and written some research reports, and we'll probably continue to do those things. The years go by, but I've never felt completely comfortable describing myself as an academic, partly because I dropped out of university, and kind of, that whilst that's definitely the right decision for me at the time, and I've no regrets at all about it, within the kind of set of social expectations that are in the world, there's a kind of a self-questioning about that, kind of maybe, I think some part of me probably got a sense of validation that was missing from not having completed that, from then finding a place in a university structure, which I think I must have got through that now because I've left.
Well, you said you've created your production company, Bosena, and you talked at the start about being a dot connector and having the combination of the particular and the general. So with this production company, you're a story, let's face it, you're a creative storyteller. How will that dot connection and general particular sort of duality manifests itself in what you're going to be, in what you're doing, because you have created some, you've done some amazing work in the past. Your iconic Man Engine project, the poster behind you of one of the films you're
I'm
involved
wearing my
with.
Man Engine t-shirt right now.
There you go.
Coincidentally.
So maybe just talk about some of these projects, how they emerged, and what your ambitions are with Bosena going forward.
I'm gonna upgrade dot connector to node vibrator, if that's a rude way of putting it. Just thinking about neural networks and
Yeah.
and mycelium is kind of like a visual sort of metaphorical space that feels a bit more dynamic and closer to reality. But that aside, so I think, I mean, what we're trying to do, Bosena, is make some good films, as a simple thing.
So, sorry, before you go, I'm just going to jump in, because as you said node vibrator, it just made me think of a previous guest I had. She said that we're all energy, and instead of saying, how are you doing today, we should always be greeting ourselves by saying, how are you vibrating today?
How are you vibrating today?
Because we vibrate energy.
Resonantly is a good reply to that. Yeah.
So, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, right, on you go.
Yeah. So like ostensibly set the company up to make films, and that's what we are doing, what our core business is, and we're expanding that out into a TV space as well, because there's some ideas that work better over longer hours than a film. I'm a great fan of 90-minute films because I usually need a wee then, and 2.5 hours is just too long to be that's still in a dark room. But so we're moving into that space, and within that, what we're trying to do is select those projects really carefully and then nurture those projects in a way into reality that is increasingly, it's an iterative process. We're far from perfect at any of it, kind of learning as we go, but trying to work out ways of developing and making and sharing work that is regenerative, that is a regenerative cultural practice. So it's something that is not an extractive industry. Filmmaking quite often is an extractive industry. It takes people's souls, it takes people's energy in a quite immersive way, and it can leave a big nasty footprint of environmental destruction as well when it's done badly, or to put it another way, when it's done business as usual, the way that it has been done, which is quite thoughtlessly and carelessly, and the only thing that really matters is the economic return on investment. So trying to shift that whilst also being in that world and trying to make it a successful business, trying to shift that thinking into a more holistic approach, an ecosophical approach, so that the social impact of every stakeholder, so that's the creative team, the cast and the crew, the community of the place that we're filming in, everybody, the audience, the financiers, everybody who's part of it, that it's a positive and constructive experience to the best of our ability within the means that we have. And environmentally, to be really trying to minimize and balance out the impact of that. So rather than just the worst kind of approach is to not care. The second worst approach is to measure it and offset it, to measure your carbon footprint and offset it and just look at it as another small number at the bottom of your budget, which is what I would say is the current industry norm, which is really sad and depressing. Within that, there is a growing community of people who are really trying to make proper change, and we count ourselves amongst those who are trying to actually do things better, and not just make small incremental changes whilst shouting about how wonderfully we're doing, but to really think long and hard and reflect on what goes well, what doesn't go well, be transparent about what goes well and transparent about what doesn't go well and where the challenges are, whether that's to do with the supply chain, whether it's to do with our own processes, and to just really get into that kind of granular forensic kind of reflection on how ideas manifest themselves in reality. A tiny seed of an idea that then grows through several years into a screenplay, into hundreds or possibly thousands of people working for months at a time into something that travels the world and potentially seen by millions of people who will travel from their homes to a theatre, or it's like all watch on a streaming platform with all of the impacts of that. And the whole world of distribution is it's kind of outside of our domain of influence in terms of what we can control, but it's probably the area in the industry that most needs looking at in terms of how to manage the impacts of it. Because it's anyway, yeah. So alongside, so with all of that and with all the various projects, something that's emerged more recently is we literally just getting started on looking at a way of and a tool for measuring our social and environmental impact in a holistic way. It's something there are tools that are out there for particularly for measuring carbon. There's some quite good carbon footprint measurements. There's not a lot else that addresses, for example, all the other sustainable development goals. So there are some things. There are social return on investment tools. There's all these things that so we're going to do a piece of work over the next 6 months looking at a way of making that easier and more productive. Maybe we'll talk about that another time.
Okay, it's interesting. When I lived in Austin, I was I'm still a member of it. It's a community called the Austin Entertainment Business. It was set up by a woman, a previous guest, Jennifer Hutchins, and she moved from LA to Texas back in 2018. Didn't know anyone, and thought, well, best way to get to know people is set up a meetup, and she did it, and about 100 people turned up for the first one, and it is all about giving voice to people. So not just bringing in a guest, a luminary from the industry, like Richard Linklater to do a talk, but to give the mic to people and say, okay, everyone has an ask and everyone has a need or has a skill. So it's an open mic. She starts the event with them saying, right, okay, if you're a writer, director, an editor, an actor, a voiceover artist, tell us who you are and tell us what you're willing to offer, and if you've got a need, tell us what it is, and then you'll connect afterwards. And it's been a wonderful self-sustaining community that grew after COVID, called the All Entertainment Business, and people come in on Zoom every month. And it's grown to be this lovely global community of people in the entertainment business that exchange their talents and their needs and their ideas, often at the time when they're sort of isolated, not knowing where to turn for their next work. And loads of projects have emerged from this great little community that she's built around the Texas area.
Right.
And I've seen it really sort of flourish. And I know that it's something that, I could see probably maybe something happening similar in, whether it be in Cornwall or in Scotland or London, where there's always people wanting to tell stories.
Yeah.
And I think it's an industry that lacks community.
It's interesting though, in the kind of for all of the necessity, and I think it is a necessity for the professionalisation and growth of a Cornish public service media, there's the sort of silver lining of the lack of that infrastructure is that rather than having a TV industry to drop into, what's emerged in Cornwall is a really, over the last 20, 30 years, is quite an organic filmmaking community, out of which certain kind of ideas and talents have flourished, and many more coming up behind them, and that's it's something which, when I talk to people from BBC Alba or from S4C, they sometimes kind of, whilst there's a so much positivity of their existence, there's also because the way that TV works, there's also a sort of maybe a bit of a restriction within that. If you go into an institution and learn your craft there, it's a very different mindset to if you do exactly what you're saying. People in Austin have done, and just kind of like-minded people come together to make something happen because they want it to happen, and it's like it's the inverse of doing things properly, but sometimes the most dynamic ideas evolve in those spaces. It's not like you can't have one or the other. They both ossify if they exist in
Mm.
isolation. But there's, I think, something interesting in the dynamic between those self-regulating kind of clusters of independent thought and more sustaining structures that sit around it. And going back to your earlier question about what does the world look like, in that sort of political paradigm, well, it probably looks a lot more like a forest, where you have got some big old trees that are holding up a great load of the ecology, but within that you've got a whole host of medium-sized trees and smaller bushes and plants and vines and climbers and fungus.
It's interesting that using that mycelium analogy, because I see even in the 3 years I was in Texas, I could see that network effect growing of what these people coming together, and what emerged from these random collisions, I call them, of people coming together, new projects emerging and growing, and the impact it had on the establishment. Another guest, James Cameron's producer, Chris DeBeck, who attended the events as well, he then took it upon himself to then go and canvass the Texas politicians to create a change in the law to create tax breaks for filmmakers to come to Texas to incentivize and to grow the media. And he created a media coalition that resulted in a big event at Dallas Cowboys Stadium last year, where you had Dennis Quaid and Matthew McConaughey talking to the audience of people in the industry. So it can go from something that's very small and organic and having that mycelial impact that grows to the point where you then transform the regulatory status of the industry in that state. And I see, they say, okay, Texas, huge state, massive, emerging, growing media industry that's there that might at some point challenge Georgia and California through the impact of these small little changes, but could have a big impact. And I can see the parallels to what you're talking about in Cornwall, when you actually sort of bring people together and you trigger the impact of people's ideas and their imagination to create systemic change.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily whilst there are large changes that need to happen, but it's not always necessarily about something escalating into a seismic change. Sometimes it's about something staying small but being self-sustaining. Sometimes it's about something growing and having a snowball effect, and sometimes it's about kind of a little fruiting moment that occurs and is a moment of beauty, and it disappears and the memory of it lingers. I guess it's all of these things, isn't it? It's kind of again sort of thinking beyond the duality. It's actually that the ecology of the things that we do and the systems that we interact with and the systems that we perpetuate is the thing that or maybe the kind of approaching things from an ecological perspective, from an idea that things can be large and small and broad and thin and different shapes and colors, and that they're all okay and that they all interact, and that beautiful diversity is the thing that connects us and makes the world beautiful, rather than it has to be this way because that's the way that either I think it should be, or I was told that I should think it should be, or it has to be because that's how it always has been. It's like leaving that thinking behind and just maybe just allowing a bit more of an organic flourishing of things and letting go of some of our preconceived ideas of how things ought to be.
Okay, well, you talked about small flourishing ideas that emerge and then disappear. I've got to ask you to just tell us a bit about a project you did some time ago, that T-shirt you're wearing, Man Engine, how it emerged and what impact it had, and just explain.
So it was quite a lifeline for me, actually. I was working. I'd taken. So I got to the point where I was thinking in my work that I wanted to just be making stuff, and it was there wasn't a great deal of opportunity that I could see around me, and some friends were setting up a commercials company, so sort of joined in with that, and having avoided like the plague going anywhere near any sort of kind of corporate commercials production work, because I kept seeing people who were like, oh yeah, I make ads and make my money that way, and then I get my creative kicks out of doing a short film once every 10 years. And it's like, no, that's not how I want to live my life. I want to make the work that I want to make. So anyway, I spent a couple of years sort of diving into this this commercials world, which was good and informative and fun in its own way, but very quickly I started feeling my soul shrivel up inside, and is this really what I want to be? Is this really what I want to be doing? Is this what I'm here for? And at that time, thinking kind of longer term about the films I wanted to make, and actually alongside that, we crowdfunded on Kickstarter for Bronco's House and made Bronco's House with Mark Jenkins. That was the sort of first sort of long form, sort of 44-minute film, long form hand processed black and white 16mm film that he made, which I produced, and that was kind of like a real labour of love and set the precedent for film like that we've made since, in terms of the kind of approach to making it. So that kind of happened, and I was just like having this existential crisis about what to do whilst feeling quite financially stuck in this situation where I kind of was earning enough to just about get by, but not really get ahead of myself there, and feeling like it felt like a real turning point in terms of this sort of, whether that's just for me or more generally in Cornwall, this sense of Cornish identity. There was a lot of talk around Cornish identity. I guess it probably was around the time that the Cornish national minority status was recognised. So there was a lot of this kind of sense of what my purpose was. Yeah, existential crisis. And then there's an artist, theatrician called Will Coleman, who had this idea for the Man Engine and pitched it to Cornish Mine. Well, it was in response to a call from the Cornish Mining World Heritage Site for their 10th anniversary celebrations, to kind of have a big community event to celebrate 10 years of that World Heritage status. And Will pitched this idea and won the pitch and put out a call for a project manager to manage this project, the Man Engine. So I thought, it's a crazy idea, a crazy half-baked idea with nowhere near enough resource in it to kind of even get started. And the idea itself is quite amorphous at this stage, and it's enough of a job to just about scrape by paying the bills for the duration of it. And it's got to be delivered. I think the job description was in, I can't remember when it was, like September, and then the event was happening in the following July. So the whole thing had to sort of come to fruition within 9-10 months, something like that. So I went for the project manager job and got it, and then really realised how much work there was going to be. How, it was a fantastic vision, but with very little of those connecting dots between the big idea and how the fuck we're going to realise this big idea.
So what was the vision?
Well, I mean, the vision was actually kind of what it ended up being, this giant mechanical tin miner kind of processing through the Cornish landscape. But how you do that, it was, we went through some very interesting iterations of ideas. At one point, we were looking at buying an old steam engine, steamroller, to be the body of the vehicle, which I'm glad we didn't go down that road, because I think that wouldn't have got us very far. And culturally, and it was the most incredible opportunity to just really dig deep into the history and kind of heritage of Cornwall, and across the whole of Cornwall as well, into Devon and the Cornish mining landscape in Devon, and kind of as a producer, with my producer head on, it was like, well, here's an impossible task, so that's great, that's where I thrive, is kind of going, how this, if you look at it on paper, you go, there's too many problems there, and that's kind of an exciting challenge to get stuck into. And the more we sort of dug into it and started developing the idea and building it up, the more impossible it became. We had lots of very exciting regular meetings with the council, public safety enforcement officers, and all the blue light services. And as the idea evolved, and we brought Volvo on board with it. They came in as a partner sponsor and provided the 30-ton digger that was the main puppeteer that kind of lifts the 10 tons of metal puppet up into the sky. It's 11 meters high. And all these conversations with the very nervous public safety officers about taking this 40-ton mechanical puppet that didn't even exist yet into town centres surrounded by tens of thousands of people, and then performing it, for some reason made them feel a little bit jittery. whilst Will and I would be like, it'll be all right, we know what we're doing. And without being facetious, we do know what we're doing, because like, although there's something that hadn't been done in that way before, we were working with engineers and incredibly talented engineers, and everything was safety tested to the nth degree. And it was some. When it came to the event itself, we performed to, I think, something like 150,000 people across 22 events over a couple of weeks, sort of moving down through Cornwall. We had a paramedic as part of the team, and in Truro, somebody had a heart attack in the crowd whilst we were there, and was resuscitated by the paramedic, because we had a paramedic there before the ambulance could get to him. So I feel like we've kind of, rather than having a risk to life, we netted one life out of that project. Like, there was a life saved that might not have been otherwise. So yeah.
Wow.
The first event was in Tavistock, and the man engine starts the performance in a prone position with a big Cornish flag draped over the whole thing. And I can't remember, there was maybe like 20,000 people in Tavistock town centre, and we had, at that moment in time, on the first day of the tour, we had 3 public enforcement notices saying that we couldn't do it unless XYZ was all done. And we'd done all of this stuff, and we'd printed it and we presented it, and then it hadn't been accepted, and then it was accepted, and there was a lot of battle of wills going on and things, and we were at this point 20 minutes before this performance started. TV cameras on cranes, all the global media were there looking at it. The event was there to happen, tens of thousands of people in the street, and 20 minutes before the start time, I got a phone call from the person who said, "Okay, yes, we accept all your paperwork now. You can get." In terms of kind of balls to the wall, kind of, going, is this going to happen? Like, we were kind of fully sunk in terms of all of the promises and all of the spend and all the rest of it that happened then. So that, in terms of a kind of an experience that molds you, that moment, kind of, after that, I thought, how hard can making a film, a big film, a more complex film, like, how hard can it be, really? It kind of, there have been moments with every film since, and I'm sure there will continue to be, particularly around the financial closing of them, which feel very similar to that, where there's a lot of risk pending a set of things falling into place at just the right moment, way after they should be happening, but just that's the nature of the beast. And I think something in that kind of, in the bloody mindedness of going, this has to happen because it means something and it's got a purpose, and it's not at all a kind of it's not at all a blustery kind of, like, it has to happen because it has to happen. It's like, this thing had such cultural importance, and the risks were very well managed around it, and the only thing that was sort of holding it back was people who were not creative minded, people who can't see things in their heads and have to have it written down and described in meticulous detail, and kind of didn't have the faith in what was happening. There were some people who were definitely trying to close it down, and I think there's an attitude that kind of gets shit done that burns through the naysayers and the can't doers, and that's the thing that, with the right cultural and social purpose, that's what social entrepreneurship should be. That's what I feel it is, my kind of motivating engine for doing stuff, is kind of going, here's an idea that needs to live. There will be people who get in the way of that. There always is people who say you can't do that, or you shouldn't do it like that, or what have you, and just need to kind of, the people who'll say, well, global capitalism is a bit of a big thing to tackle, isn't it? Surely we should just be quiet, sit in the corner and let it carry on regardless, whilst the world burns around us and people lose their lives and live in fear and poverty and pain. But I don't think we should do that. I think we should put all our energy and soul into changing things for the better.
So I'd like to just get on to some quickfire questions, but a couple of just things, because if you've just framed that past experience and what you learned from it and all the other productions you've done since Man Engine, you must have some sage advice you could give to any aspiring filmmaker, not just from Cornwall, but from other regions of the world, particularly maybe working with minority languages or cultures. What advice could you give them that where they might be struggling?
I think it's really important to think long and hard about what the stories are, what the story is, like what it is that you're trying to say. It's the hardest thing, but it's the most important thing, because getting that right, it's like it's when the story lives, and that can be in a in a couple of sentences or in a script, or like when it lives, when you can feel the beating heart of it, then it has to live, it has to exist, and then it's just about kind of funneling the right people and resources into it to bring it to fruition. But it's so important to get that seed of the idea right. And sometimes people have those ideas come to them in a moment. Sometimes they take a bit of work to get to that point. But once it's there, then my advice is to, come hell or high water, make it happen. There are a million reasons why a film can't be made, and there's only one reason why a film will get made, and that's because you're bloody well making it. And it might take you 6 months, it might take you 6 years, it might take you 20 years, but if it's the right story, and if it needs to be told, and you've got the passion to bring it to life, then nobody's going to stop you. Nobody's going to get in the way. And if they do, just walk past them and move on to the next person, next place. And there's a lot of good people out there. There's a lot of good-hearted, caring, sharing people who will help. So you just need to kind of not. I think sometimes people become, and I've been guilty of this myself in the past, become their own worst enemy and kind of going, it's not fair, it's not going to happen, I can't do this, because of this person or that institution or this gatekeeper. Don't get stuck in that mental hell, because the only thing that's going to make something happen is if you believe in it, and if you don't believe in it, then it won't happen.
Great advice. One of my previous guests, Don Smith, talked about his philosophy on life, which is based on a German philosopher's view that we are all in a state of emergence. You talked about what you were like growing up and what made you. The experiences you've had along your journey of social entrepreneurship, your accidental academia, and the impact you've been having through the productions and the films you've been making. How have you changed on a personal level? How has it altered your mindset or your lifestyle?
I've become more confident. I think is probably the thing that's changed most over the last decade. Really, since the Man Engine, actually, I think that was a real turning point. And then with Ennis Main and what's been happening since, it's like definitely I feel, God, it's taken 50 years to get here, but I feel like I feel a confidence in who I am and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and how I'm doing it, in a way that when I was 18, I'd have told you I felt that, but I would have been blustering my way through it with that kind of with the joy of youthful arrogance that you can only have at that age. But yeah, I feel like a rooted confidence, I think.
Okay. Can we have some time for some quick fire personal questions?
Far away.
Who or what inspires you?
I'm going to say what I don't think I could pick out a person. A lot of people do inspire me. A lot of people around me inspire me. But the thing that inspires me more than anything is the land that I live in, Penwith, the Penwith landscape, the ancient, ugly, harrowed, beautiful, jagged, granite, furzy landscape is just like, it just brings me joy and makes me want to do things. Sometimes those things are just being in it. Sometimes they're thriving ideas that are seeded from it. But yeah, that's the thing that feeds my soul.
Okay. You talked about the fact that you become more confident, but we all have to deal with fears, uncertainties, and doubts at times. How do you deal with it?
So, denial, first of all, and then trying to move beyond that into acceptance. I read a really good thing recently. There's this Inflow app that I've been working through, which is really helping me kind of understand my brain better.
Mhm.
And there was a thing in that said, I think it was RAIN was the acronym. It was, if you're having an emotional response to something that is kind of, is like a negative emotional response, recognize, accept, interrogate, and nurture. So it's about kind of like being present with that feeling, accepting that it's there, allowing it to be there, investigating or interrogating where it comes from, and then nurturing that place. So that really resonated, and actually kind of is a good acronym, good little system. And many years ago, I with my wife, we went and did a Vipassana meditation retreat when my wife was pregnant with our daughter, and we spent 10 days sat in isolated silence meditating for 10 hours a day, and it was
Wow.
intense experience of my life. And my practice comes and ebbs and flows like the tide, but it's always stayed with me as well, that kind of the intensity and the just kind of, it's like you turn your brain inside out. And it's just so I think trying to find those moments to just sit in stillness and observe my breath and just keep coming back to that and not be constantly overthinking things is my challenge and my savior.
Great advice. What would you like your legacy to be?
The transformation of late stage capitalism into a joyous, mycelially connected future.
Nicely put.
Just that.
You mentioned a couple of books, so I've got those ones logged, so I'll put those in the show notes. Any important film, show, or doc that you think people should watch apart from yours?
As well as mine, the
Aside from, yeah.
the corporation. I can't remember who the filmmakers are.
Oh, yeah. Another one. Yeah.
The corporation, and actually, although it's probably a bit dated now, some of it, the film they made before Noam Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky in the Media,
Yeah.
it like is a genius documentary, and that's and it's kind of very self-referential about the fact that it is a documentary. But yeah, it's just kind of, it just is as true today as it was when it was made probably 20, 30 years ago, about the idea of manufactured consent. I think for intellectual self-defense, it's like it's a 101. Can I mention a couple other films?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So my absolute all-time favorite film ever is Dreams, Akira Kurosawa's
Oh,
Dreams,
yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
which is just absolutely stunning in every which way. Particularly the Fox's Wedding and the old man at the water wheel. I can't remember what the section's called, but yeah, just some of the images in that film just are kind of as beautiful as the Penrith landscape, I'll say. And then I'm going to mention two more films. One that I saw a couple of years ago that has really stayed with me, which is Memoria, a picture of Paul Thackel's film Memoria with Tilda Swinton. Just genius. Absolutely loved that film. It was kind of my favourite film of the year, and kind of haven't really seen a lot since that stood out above it. And then as a recent and connected to the indigenous languages, Kneecap. Kneecap is an amazing film about this Irish language West Belfast rap group called Kneecap. It's starring themselves, and it is fucking amazing.
I know them because they're my friend Graham McIndoe, who's a photographer in New York. They basically asked them to be their photographer on their recent tour.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
what a great film, and what a great experience.
Okay.
quite
Well,
different, an eclectic mix there for you.
that's good. Okay, just a couple of more questions. You talked about your retreat and the silent retreat. Any life hack besides that?
Yeah, just watch a cloud go by. Like, don't just glance at it, just like watch it until it disappears. That's something I don't do enough, but when I do, it just brings you into the moment really nicely.
Yeah, that's really good. I mentioned random collisions. Part of the reason for the podcast is to tap into serendipity and engineer random collisions between people. Are you open for me making a few connections between some of my other guests?
I'm a great believer in cultivating serendipity and would happily welcome that.
Okay, there is one person I should connect you with. So a guy called Mike Coulter. He's an ex-ad guy from my days at Leith Agency, and he lives in Padstow.
Right.
He's part of a thing called the Do Lectures. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
No,
It's a guy called David Height, and he runs these events called the Do Lectures in Cornwall, and Mike lives down there. And I think you and Mike would hit it off. You're both great storytellers. And I'll connect you with Jen Hutchins as well from the Austin entertainment business, because I think you're, as creative people, you should always be connected.
Great.
And I have to give a shout out to Alex Fish for the connection, 99p Cinema.
I noticed him on your website there. Yeah, great.
99p Films, I should say, which is a great
yeah.
social enterprise and great initiative. So thanks to Alex for this connection, which leads me to the final question, which is who should I interview next?
So I was thinking about this. I've narrowed it down to 4 people, but do you just want one?
You can not tell me now. You can just email me their connections, and we take it from there. I trust in the serendipity of it.
Yeah. Do you want a name now?
Give me one of them who you think could be interesting.
I think, and the reason why I'm going to pick this person is because she is one of the most serendipitously connectory type people I've ever met. I don't know her very well, but have had some serendipitous connections with her. Amanda Brockman, who runs a thing called Cafe Disruptive, which is a kind of a physical gathering of minds, much like this, that happens from time to time. And yeah, and she was the person who introduced me to donut economics.
Well, then she would be a great connection. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll take it from there.
All right.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's almost an hour and 50 minutes. Restroom lube break definitely on the cards. So yeah, Denzil, thank you very much for your time, your energies, your creativity, your enduring curiosity, dot connections, vibration, node vibrations, and for being an amazing wide vista and very specific storyteller. And I think when people hear this, you talk about having an impact, even if it's one person, I think some of your perspective on the world is refreshing and engaging and energizing. So I think it will have a ripple effect. So thank you.
Miraz Braz, Mark. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Okay, that's all for now, folks. Now here's my ask of you. Please follow this podcast on Apple or Spotify or whatever player you use. Also, please subscribe to our new Random Collisions newsletter. We really are working to build a global community of action takers, action engines of people that really care about the problems that need solving. Thank you very much, and see you next time.